Okay, hello everybody, this is Talking Jobs with me, rbromnick, and today the topic is educational psychology. So this is one of the applied psychology routes through the BPS to becoming chartered, and just a little bit about education psychology before we meet our guests. So you'd be working with children and young people, looking at their experiences of life in the context of school, but also in the home environment. And I found out a little bit more, I think, about educational psychology that perhaps I wasn't so aware of. So as well as maybe challenges around certain learning or literacy challenges, educational psychologists are working increasingly with social and emotional problems and helping people with disabilities and complex developmental disorders. So you'd be using your psychological skills to help affect positive outcomes. But I was interested, I'll tell you what I did find. I looked at the recent Educational Psychology Conference from the division at the BPS, and the title of their conference was about responding to children in the 21st century, their rights, voices and sense of belonging. So I thought that was a really kind of interesting development within educational psychology, putting young people right at the heart of the work that is being carried out. So we're going to meet our guest and find out loads more about educational psychology. So stay tuned, everybody, and I'll welcome our guest. So in the studio today, welcome Katie Chapman.
Hello.
Oh, it's really lovely to see you, Katie. Thank you for coming in.
It's my pleasure.
Now, some people are taking the mickey out of me because when I introduce one of our graduates, I always say, this is one of our finest graduates. And they say, well, Rachel, not everyone could be the finest graduate. But, you know, we're really proud of you, Katie, and so pleased to, with the success that you've been having. So you graduated in 2006.
That's right, yeah.
And you went on, and now you're a qualified educational psychologist.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
So why don't you just tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing, and then we'll sort of backtrack and talk about routes to training and things.
Okay, well, the role of an educational psychologist can really vary across, depending on where you work. So depending on if you work for a local authority or a charity or an independent company, it can be so different. So what I'm going to talk about today is primarily from Nottinghamshire's educational psychology kind of perspective. So for me, the role that I've been taking on is around embracing psychology, applying psychology in order to ensure that the most vulnerable children, that their needs are being met and that they're being included in schools, in their community, in their families. So I think that's, for me, is the most pivotal role that I've been doing. It's about gathering people's voice. It's ensuring that they're being heard. It is around social inclusion, and that's what I aim for on a day-to-day basis in everyday conversations with school staff, with parents, with children. It's about advocating for them, advocating for the most vulnerable, and that can be children in care, it could be children with severe and complex needs, communication needs. As you said, we're working more now with children presenting with social and emotional needs around their mental health and promoting positive well-being. It's so
really
varied.
yeah.
Varied, and the age range as well. We're working within nurseries right through to further education, so in colleges as well at the moment. So every day is just very different, very unique.
I think it's come a really long way, hasn't it, since the sort of days when people might have thought it's just about psychometric testing and IQ testing.
Definitely.
It's really evolved as a profession, I think.
I'd like to think so. So Nottinghamshire are the only psychology service in the country that have a no to IQ tests policy. So as a collective group, we've decided that it's not, in our professional view, it is not the most efficient use of our time, and it's not empowering to children. It can be quite deficit led. It can be about categorisation and about I guess, being deterministic, and scores and can be very
labels.
Yeah, but it can be very damaging, and it can be narrowing to that individual child. So when a child has been through very, very tricky situations that you wouldn't even be able to imagine, really, to then sit them in a room and carry out psychometric assessments, it's not...
It's very abstract, isn't it?
It's not applicable to real life. And so the work that we do is more around positive psychology, solution-focused consultations. So it's very different. It's very different. And I guess, again, it does depend on where you work. There may be a big emphasis on diagnosing and psychometrics, but that's certainly not the case in Nottinghamshire and in other local authorities as well.
All right. Just doing my research for this podcast, I found quite a lot being written about what was called a dynamic assessment.
Oh, yes.
I didn't tell you I was going to ask you about this, so I put you on the spot now. Could you just explain what that is? Because I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it's a different kind of assessment. So there's a lot of debate around what assessment should look like. So some educational psychologists will readily endorse kind of a dynamic assessment approach, and that's more around looking at how a child approaches a task and what kind of skills are they bringing to the task. So it is very solution focused. They're given a novel task to complete, and you are there as a facilitator, as a mediator, to see. It kind of goes back to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So it's how much mediation that child needs in order to see how they learn best. So it's less deterministic. It's more context based,
less deficit based,
yes.
As you're looking at what they can do.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So some local authorities and their psychology service really endorse dynamic assessment as a more child-led, valuable approach. And the feedback from teachers and from school staff, they do find it, the information that they get is more applicable to the classroom.
Right. So they can apply it more to actually helping people. Right.
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
great. I think some people might think that most of your work will be sort of directly with children, but I understand that you do a lot of work with teachers or with the school systems as a whole. So
that's right.
Do you have any examples of sort of projects you've worked on with schools? Or
Yes, yeah. I think primarily, I would say rarely, but direct work with children, unless we're gathering pupil voice, it's quite rare. We tend to be working with the systems around the child. And at a more strategic level, really. So, for example, an observation that we made were a lot of schools were struggling with pupils that were presenting a high level of anxiety that were unable to go into schools. And we used the research around the psychology around anxiety. And this project around anxiety-related non-attendance was created, and we delivered training across the county to help people become aware of the best approaches that work for children presenting with anxiety and struggling to access school in that way. And now schools have been able to use that psychology, have been able to use that as a foundation to help prevent...
Right, so create a healthier environment.
Exactly, and prevent situations escalating, being aware of how they can put things into place so that the anxiety doesn't become too kind of perpetuating and too ingrained. Yes, yeah.
It's a big thing with young people, isn't it?
It is.
Obviously cuts across all different kinds of services. And
it does, yeah. It is a crisis, but it seems to be a lot of the work at the moment, and I think that's around being, as a psychologist, just being aware of the systems and the political demands that schools are having to take on board. I really, really respect those that work in education, because it's a difficult job, and with tightening budgets and the pressures of academia, they feel less able and less resourced in order to meet those children's needs that are struggling. So I guess we're there as no, you are doing the right thing. You do
reassure people. And
that's right. Yeah. So that's an example of a piece of kind of strategic work that we did as a team. We also do work with schools around transition. So because transition always tends to be a bit of a wobbly time.
Is that students coming into schools?
Yeah, from year 6 to year 7. So the move from primary to secondary school is always a bit of a wobbly one for children presenting with special educational needs. And I guess another example as well, some psychology services protect time around research. So we do, at the moment, our service is evaluating a mindfulness-based intervention that's been put into place across several schools across Nottinghamshire, and we're the impartial researchers that are going in to evaluate how effective that intervention is.
Interesting. Is it qualitative, quantitative?
It's mixed. We're doing a mixed method. Right. Yeah.
So for students listening from our undergraduate programs, their research skills are really important, aren't they, for working and training as an educational psychologist?
Definitely, without a doubt. When I started the doctorate, that was research is a huge theme across the entire 3 years, and it continues into the workplace. And yes, research tends to be the first thing that disappears when under time demands, but when given the opportunities in a service, psychologists do have the research skills, and we are often asked to be that impartial researcher, we do have those skills to apply research methodology in a real world context.
I guess it sort of intersects with your critical thinking skills to take that sort of idea of research, even if you're not doing primary research, but to take that sort of process of, well, what is the evidence?
Yes.
And what works and what theories.
That's it. Our work is driven by evidence base. We're constantly looking at the evidence base around what we may be endorsing or suggesting, and as part, even just on individual case level work, we're constantly thinking about the problem solving, informing our hypotheses by what we know around psychology and the evidence base that is there. And our kind of research, the research time also allows us to do that kind of work. So another example is that there's a group of us that went into a alternative provision. So that's where children often end up after they're excluded from a school, or a school is struggling and they need a different kind of curriculum. So we went into an alternative provision and initiated some action research with a group of pupils. And
what's action research? What's action research?
The ownership is placed on the people that are within that community. So the research question is developed by the participants rather than the researcher.
So they're not the object of research. You're researching with them rather than on them.
Exactly. So we're the facilitators. We're the ones that we went in and did a working group around what they felt it meant to be resilient. And that was our general theme. So we had this theme of resiliency, and then the young people talked around that, and then had to come up with ideas of what they were interested in. So they're in an alternative provision, their voice is not often heard, and we were using our skills and knowledge of the education system and knowledge of how to interact with young people to help ensure that they do have a voice. And so the idea of action research is that they will take that on board, and they now have a research question that they want to carry on, and so they will become the researchers themselves, and they want to find out more from other young people in alternative provisions.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah,
Really empowering, isn't it?
It is, and the ideas that they came up with, they were just fantastic.
You wouldn't have necessarily thought of, no.
No, exactly. And it's the idea that if they take it on board, that they deserve to own it, not us. And it's being aware of that power dynamic in our work, that we should be facilitating empowerment. We shouldn't be we're not the experts,
right?
The people going through it, the people
yeah.
having on the ground, they're the experts, they're the one with the experiences. We're merely there to help facilitate things and move things forward.
It's a really interesting approach. I'll tell you what comes to my mind. I was reading something about medical problems, and like doctors saying, don't Google the problem because I've spent 10 years at medical school, I'm the expert. And then someone was replying, well, I've lived with this condition for 10 years, so don't tell me what it's like. It seems to have a parallel with that you have that education and knowledge of theories, but in doing so you're able to sort of turn the table back to putting the person rather than yourself at the heart of it all.
Exactly, and I think that's what we try and do with working with schools. They are so experienced and so skilled, and they have the capacity there to move situations forward, and the idea is that we are there to build capacity for them, and we want them to take ownership of the situation, because actually they are the ones with the experience and the skills. And I think it does depend. When you do the doctorate, you will become the educational psychologist that you want to be, and you will be drawn to services that will work in particular ways in accordance to kind of your values and your beliefs. So I'm talking from my perspective and my values and my beliefs, but another educational psychologist listening to this may feel slightly different, depending on their training, their experience, and their kind of aspirations of what it means to be a psychologist.
All right, well, let's talk about some of those routes into training, because I know that a number of our students are interested. So this is my understanding. You have to have your BSc has to be recognised by the British Psychological Society.
That's right.
Or other students who are listening, they can go through a conversion course route. And then people typically get a year's experience. So we'll talk about that, a year or more. And then you'll be looking to do one of the doctoral programmes in educational psychology. It's best to check out the latest information from the BPS and other organisations, because some of those doctoral programmes vary a little bit in what their title is, but you'll be looking to do a doctorate. You don't need to do a PhD before you start. No. You don't need to do a master's before you start.
No, not anymore. No.
So let's just talk about that space then between the two periods of study where people are gaining experience. What sort of experience did you get, or what experience do you know other people got after graduating?
It really did vary. So within my cohort of trainees, we had a learning support assistant in a secondary school. There were around 3 primary school teachers. There were about 4 assistant educational psychologists, or graduate psychologists, as some local authorities called them. And then I was an educational psychologist, assistant educational psychologist at the time. So it really did.
They don't require you to be an assistant, because it's a bit like clinical. Those roles are so rare, aren't they? They don't require it.
No, not at all. And I would say that everyone came on the doctorate with different skills and experiences, and everyone had their own gaps to fill depending on their experiences. So it wasn't as though all the assistant psychologists stood out. I would say those that worked for the local authority had a little bit more understanding of how things work, but then the primary school teachers knew more around how the school systems worked, and the learning mentor knew how to gather a pupil's voice, and knew about how the secondary school systems work. So it didn't really matter. It was more around how you applied psychology, and that's the big thing that Nottingham University really emphasise. It's about the application of psychology. It's not around your title or your role. It's how you've used that psychology in order to move situations forward and listen to
understand the world
people.
Yes,
definitely. So there was this notion, I remember when I left university, and it was this notion of you need to find an assistant psychologist post, and that pressure can be really kind of
they're so
overwhelming.
rare.
Yes,
if they're there at all.
Exactly. And with the political climate at the moment, they are rare, but equally I think there's so many roles, particularly with educational psychology, that you could go into, as long as you're applying that psychology and you're reflective and you're a critical thinker, or you're using your research skills. Don't be disheartened. You use that experience.
So I think we'd recommend to people, get some volunteering whilst you're doing your degree.
Yes.
You know, if you think you want to work with children, then get yourself out there, different environments, and then look for that first post afterwards. Sometimes people don't know if this all is what they want to do, and that's fine, because I think if you get that experience, you're setting yourself up for educational psychology, but you're also allowing yourself to divert, aren't you?
Exactly.
If you want to divert into teaching or into another
I did all
child
sorts.
profession.
I was a school governor, so that I got experience in a kind of the overview of a mainstream school. I worked as a playroom volunteer for an intervention for a child that was had a diagnosis of autism. So, and that was a home-based intervention. So that was really different and quite inspirational for me. I did work for Mind, the charity Mind. So because I just wanted to kind of
to get those different environments.
So there was, and eventually, I did offer to do some shadowing within an educational psychology team within an independent school, and at the end of that experience, they said, there's actually a role at the moment. So would you like to be interviewed for it? And I was.
Oh yes,
and I was like, let me think about this.
Yes, bite your hand off.
So volunteering for me, shadowing, opened doors without a doubt. And if I hadn't have done that, I don't know. It'd be interesting to know where I would be right
like
now.
one of those movies.
Sliding doors. Yeah, what would have happened?
All right. Well, you've done really well, Katie, and I know that you're, so loyal to your first institution here at Lincoln.
I am indeed. Yes.
And anyone listening from Lincoln University, Katie always comes back every year to do a talk as part of our series of seminars for third years. So look out for that date, because you'll get a chance to hear a little bit more about Katie's work and her tips to support you. So just before we finish and thank Katie, we're going to do another of our prize giveaways. So anyone listening to this, if you want to email me, Rachel Bromnick, with the right answer to this question, you'll win a small but valuable prize. So my question for you today is, who was the first educational psychologist in the UK? I should maybe get you to write an essay about why there was a big scandal, but I won't do that. It's just a simple question. Who was the first educational psychologist in the UK? You can email in your answers for a chance for a prize. And just to now thank Katie for coming in. Thank you, Katie. Good luck with your work. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just say bye. Bye.